All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our June edition Learning Cafe. On Juneteenth, we're going to take a couple minutes to let everyone filter in. We got a good one and we got some good numbers. We're expecting a large crowd, so come right on in and let us know in the chat where you're hailing from. We like to know the locations and how far reaching our great event can be. So let us know where you're coming from. Yes. Rochester, we got some Syracuse in the house. We got Long Island, yes. Albany, 518 native, let's go. I like that. Binghamton, Buffalo, Utica, Scarsdale, Rochester. Fill it right on up, come right on in. Do we have any Texans in the house? We have an event. We're doing our session on Juneteenth. Who's excited about it? Hyde Park, East Harlem. Former Texan, okay. That's good. Nice. We got Connecticut. I got family in New Haven. Great place. Yes. Hello, all. Yes, we got a lot of people in the house. All right, let's do something a little bit different. Let me get some zodiac signs in the chat. I want to see all the elements represented. Oh, here we Cancer, Gemini, Scorpio. Yes. Got some caps. Scorpio stand up. Yes. Sagittarius. There we go. Just making sure everyone is alive and attentive. This is great. This is great.
Is it okay that we get started?
Absolutely.
Okay. Do you still have a lot of people in the waiting room?
No.
Okay. Well, then we're going to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Fanny Glover. I am the Director of Equity and Inclusion at the Early Care and Learning Council, and I'm honored that you are all here today. And my colleague, Elijah. Go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Elijah Folks. It's a pleasure to meet everyone here. I work closely with Fanny Glover over at ECLC. I'm the Equity and Inclusion Program Associate, and I just want to let everyone know you're bound to be educated. You're going to enjoy a very great presentation. I just ask that everyone, if you do have any pressing questions, that you put those questions in the Q&A section so that we can filter them properly for our guest speaker. You're free to communicate in the chat, talk to one another, leave messages for us, but any important questions, please save them in the Q&A. Thank you, Fanny.
Okay, thank you so much, Elijah. Before we get started, what I'd like to do, and before we introduce our distinguished guest speaker, what I'd like to do is acknowledge the indigenous land and culture of New York. We honor the land as the Creator intended, in that we commit to keep it clean and support efforts to make it safe for all. We can show honor to the native keepers of the land by recognizing the value of their culture, by learning the truth of their history and how it shaped this great country. So now I'd like to bring your attention to the fact that on October 14th, 2020, our Governor Cuomo signed legislation designating Juneteenth as an official public holiday in New York State. Juneteenth, an American history of the long road to freedom. Juneteenth is a celebration of the end of slavery in the United States and of the generations of Black Americans who fought for freedom and equality. Juneteenth was first celebrated in Texas to commemorate the date when U.S. Army troops and news of the Emancipation Proclamation reached the state on June 19, 1865. Today, nearly every state celebrates this date, including New York, which will observe Juneteenth as a state holiday for the first time this year. This presentation will discuss how Juneteenth is a time for joy, for building community, and for talking honestly about our nation's history. Now a little bit about our guest speaker. Dr. Matthew Delmont is the Sherman Fairchild Distinguished Professor of History, an expert on African American history and the history of the civil rights, and is the author of several books. He was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship and National Endowment for the Humanities Public Scholar Award to support this research. He regularly shares his research with media outlets, including the New York Times, NPR, The Atlantic, and the Washington Post. Dr. Delmont has spoken and consulted with Fortune 500 companies, universities, colleges, and community organizations regarding civil rights, diversity, and inclusion, and how to reckon with the history of racism in America. Please, I now pass this platform over to Dr. Matthew Delmont.
Thank you so much, Fanny, for that nice introduction. Thank you, Elijah, for getting us started. I'm gonna take just 1 minute and share my slides. It's a real honor to join you to celebrate Juneteenth a little bit in advance. I'd like to start by acknowledging how much we've collectively witnessed and experienced over the past year. There's a joke among academics that in the future, historians won't focus on the entire 18th or 19th century, but instead will specialize on March 2020, June 2020, or January 2021. To say that we've seen a lot would be an understatement. I'm sure that over the past year, many of you have felt some mixture of sadness, confusion, exhaustion, anger. I know that I have. Last summer's protest shook me because I grew up in downtown Minneapolis and played sports at Martin Luther King Park, which is about a mile from where George Floyd was killed. I haven't lived in the Twin Cities since I was 18, but seeing your hometown on the national news is troubling. So in some days, I can feel pretty pessimistic, but not every day. On more optimistic days, I think that history can bring both the past and present into clear focus. And the story of Juneteenth is a perfect example of this. The story of Juneteenth calls us to reckon with the history of our country and to come together in community to celebrate the generations of Black Americans who have fought for freedom and equality. Juneteenth is a time for both honesty and joy, which we need now as much as ever. During our time together today, I'll start by exploring the origins of Juneteenth. Next, I'll explain how Juneteenth encourages us to tell a fuller and more truthful story of American history. Finally, I'll share 3 lessons from Juneteenth that can help guide us today. The image on my introductory slide is a 5,000 square foot mural by artist Reginald Adams, which was dedicated earlier this month in Galveston, Texas. The story of Juneteenth starts in Galveston, an island city on the Gulf Coast of Texas. If you think back to your high school or college history classes, you'll remember that on January 1st, 1863, President Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This proclamation declared that all persons held as slaves within the rebellious Confederate States are and henceforth shall be free. The Emancipation Proclamation articulated a powerful idea that captured the hearts and imaginations of millions of Americans, both Black and white. It added moral force to the Union cause and strengthened the Union both militarily and politically. It helped redefine the Civil War from a struggle to preserve the Union to one focused on ending slavery. As important as the Emancipation Proclamation was, however, it had little actual effect on freeing any of the nation's 4 million enslaved people. Enslaved people in states like Alabama, Georgia, and Mississippi were still unfree, as were more than 250,000 Black Texans. Since the story of Juneteenth starts in Texas, let me pause here and share a passage from the Declaration when Texas left the United States in 1861 to join the Confederacy of slaveholding states. People like to pretend sometimes that slavery wasn't the main cause of the Civil War, which is why it's useful to focus on primary sources of what people said at the time. The delegates from Texas argued that slavery was authorized and justified by God and was actually beneficial to enslaved Black people. They wrote, "We hold as undeniable truths that the governments of the various states were established exclusively by the white race for themselves and their posterity, that the African race had no agency in their establishment, that they were rightfully held and regarded as an inferior and dependent race, and in that condition only could their existence in the country be rendered beneficial or tolerable. They did not mince words. Everyone understood that Texas and the other Confederate states wanted slavery and the racial hierarchies it reinforced to continue. This was in 1861. By the summer of 1865, Confederate General Robert E. Lee had surrendered at the Appomattox Courthouse, and the Civil War was officially over. But even 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, there were still thousands of Black people in Galveston who were held in slavery. It was not until June 19th, 1865, that Union troops arrived in Galveston to take control of the state that the Emancipation Proclamation really came to Texas. General Gordon Granger, a West Point graduate and career U.S. Army officer from Wayne County, New York, stood on Texas soil and read General Orders No. 3. It said, "The people of Texas are informed that, in accordance with the proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free." This was the seed that grew into Juneteenth. It's called Juneteenth because news of freedom arrived in Texas on June 19th. The first Juneteenth was celebrated the following year, in 1866 in Texas. Free Black women, men, and children came together for community gatherings that included cookouts, prayers, sporting events, dances, parades, and the singing of spirituals. In later years, the day was celebrated as Juneteenth Independence Day, Freedom Day, Emancipation Day, or Jubilee Day. Whatever name was used, the core of the celebration remained the same. It was a time for Black communities to come together to recall the gains that had been made since emancipation and to strengthen themselves for the battles that remained to achieve actual freedom and equality. In 1872, a group of Black ministers and businessmen in Houston purchased 10 acres of land and created Emancipation Park. The park, which is still in Houston's 3rd Ward, has hosted Juneteenth celebrations for nearly 150 years. During the late 1800s and early 1900s, Juneteenth was primarily celebrated only in Texas. As Black Texans migrated to other states, they took Juneteenth with them, first to neighboring states like Louisiana, Arkansas, and Oklahoma, and eventually to California, the Midwest, and the Northeast. After the Civil Rights era of the 1960s, Juneteenth celebrations expanded in the 1970s as expressions of Black cultural pride. In 1980, Texas became the first state to make Juneteenth a state holiday. During the 1990s and 2000s, 47 states officially commemorated Juneteenth in some way. And since the summer of 2020, several of these states, including Massachusetts, New York, and Washington, have recognized Juneteenth as a state holiday. It's really only in the last year that Juneteenth has gone from being a holiday celebrated almost exclusively within the Black community to being an event that's being commemorated in corporate workplaces and broader civic spaces. As a historian, I'm always excited when more people are interested in thinking about history. But I also know there can be pitfalls when people engage with history selectively, especially African-American history. For example, if Juneteenth gets watered down so that the focus is only on cookouts, or if it's seen only as a day off from work, we won't be doing justice to the history of this holiday. That's why it's so important that Juneteenth encourages us to tell a fuller and more truthful story of American history. Let me go back to June 19th, 1865 to explain what I mean. I read you the first part of General Granger's order announcing that the enslaved people of Texas were free. However, there's also a second part of the order which says, "The freedmen are advised to remain quietly at their present homes and work for wages. They are informed that they will not be allowed to collect at military posts and that they will not be supported in idleness either there or elsewhere." In other words, Black Texans were told they would be free, just not too free. The reason the order was phrased this way is that General Granger and other Northern troops and politicians understood that the prospect of emancipation would be met with resistance, disdain, and violence by the majority of white Southerners, and it was. This played out in the period after the Civil War, from 1865 to 1877. This period was called Reconstruction, and it was one of the most pivotal eras in our nation's history. It was a period that determined how much actual freedom would exist for Black Americans after slavery. At the national level, Congress passed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which outlawed slavery, granted citizenship and equal legal protection to formerly enslaved people, and extended voting rights to Black men. In the South, Black citizens joined with white allies to bring the Republican Party to power and elect Black men to political offices. 16 Black Americans served in Congress during Reconstruction, more than 600 in state legislatures, and hundreds more across the South in local offices like sheriff and justice of the peace. This is why today you'll often hear Black politicians referred to as the first since Reconstruction to hold a certain post. Reconstruction was far from perfect for Black Americans. The proposed 40 acres that was to be distributed to each formerly enslaved person was instead returned to white planters. Without land, most former slaves had little economic alternative other than to resume work on plantations owned by whites. Still, for Black Americans, the period of Reconstruction was a brief moment of hard-earned progress. For many white Americans, particularly those in the South, Reconstruction was a radical and unwelcome disruption of the status quo. It was as if their worlds had been turned upside down. Formerly enslaved people who were once held as property were now demanding and being accorded equal political rights. White Americans who opposed Reconstruction fought back in several ways. In 1865, a group of Confederate veterans formed the Ku Klux Klan, a paramilitary force that sought to reverse the federal government's policies in the South. The KKK staged night raids where they assaulted and killed Black people, destroyed homes and churches, and generally tried to terrorize Black communities. Resistance to Reconstruction also came through established political channels. By 1876, white Democrats who opposed Reconstruction controlled most of the Southern states. The returns from that year's presidential contest were disputed, and Republican Rutherford B. Hayes agreed to a bargain. He would recognize Democratic control of the remaining Southern states if the Democrats would not block the certification of his election by Congress. Once the deal was struck and Hayes was inaugurated, federal troops were removed from the South. Once this happened, there was no one in the South to protect the rights of former slaves other than Black people themselves. With this, Reconstruction and the possibilities it held came to an end. It's impossible to understand and appreciate the history of Juneteenth without understanding this history of Reconstruction. When Black Texans gathered on June 19th in the years after the Civil War, they were celebrating emancipation, but they were also asking a very basic question. Is what we're living through right now actually freedom? This is what I meant earlier when I said that Juneteenth is a time for joy and honesty. These early Juneteenth celebrations were certainly celebratory. Some even featured an early version of fireworks, where trees were filled with gunpowder and set on fire. But these early Juneteenth celebrations were also brutally honest about what Black people had endured and continued to endure in America. In the decades immediately after the Civil War, most of the people who attended Juneteenth celebrations had been born into slavery. Their scars, both physical and psychological, were powerful evidence that emancipation and freedom were not just words on paper, but values that were only meaningful if they could be experienced in real life. With formerly enslaved people in attendance, there was no way not to reckon honestly with the history of slavery, even in the midst of a joyous summer celebration. The twin themes of joy and honesty are the through line that connect Juneteenth celebrations from 1865 to 2021. In each of the past 156 years, Black Americans have celebrated emancipation while also asking that same basic question. Is what we're living through right now actually freedom? While I can't tell you what people said or thought at every historical Juneteenth event, I do know that two consistent topics during Juneteenth have been voting rights and racial violence. In the midst of Reconstruction, for example, Juneteenth celebrations would have featured the words of famed abolitionist Frederick Douglass and minister Henry McNeil Turner. Douglass warned that the United States would not endure if racial hierarchy remained the order of the day. He said, "No republic is safe that tolerates a privileged class or denies to any of its citizens equal rights and equal means to maintain them. What was theory before the war has been made fact by the war." Just 2 years later, in 1868, Henry McNeil Turner expressed outrage that Black people were being forced out of politics. Turner was one of 33 Black legislators elected to the Georgia House of Representatives. He pushed to restore voting rights to ex-Confederates as a gesture of goodwill, but was shocked when white members of the state legislature, both Democrats and Republicans, put aside party differences and voted to expel Black lawmakers. Turner said, "The sacred rights of my race were destroyed at one blow." He delivered a passionate speech that was featured in Juneteenth celebrations and became a rallying cry for the civil rights movement 100 years later. "Am I a man?" he asked. "If I am such, I claim the rights of a man." As Douglass and Turner understood, the premature end of Reconstruction was a life and death issue for Black Americans. It meant that the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were only rights in theory, not in practice. This became clear once Southern states disenfranchised Black people so that they had no voting rights and could not hold elected office. It became clear once Southern states began to pass Jim Crow laws that made certain public spaces, schools, and sections of trolley cars and trains off limits to Black people. And it became clear every time a white mob lynched a Black person, while the legal system turned a blind eye. No one saw the violence of Jim Crow segregation more clearly or fought it more passionately than Ida B. Wells. Wells was a crusading journalist and activist. She fought for women's suffrage and against racial violence. She drew connections to how racism and sexism interacted in the lives of Black Americans. Wells was practicing intersectionality decades before legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw coined that term. Wells's words rang out at Juneteenth celebrations in the late 1800s and early 1900s. She wrote, "With no sacredness of the ballot, there can be no sacredness of human life itself. For if the strong can take a weak man's ballot when it suits his purpose to do so, he will take his life also." Wells saw that without voting rights, it was nearly impossible for Black Americans to exercise any other rights or protect their property and lives. The ability to defend oneself, one's family, and one's community was on the minds of Juneteenth audiences in the years immediately after World War I. More than 350,000 Black war veterans returned home, hopeful that their service in Europe would result in more racial equality in the United States. Instead, these veterans were disillusioned by the hate and scorn they experienced from their fellow Americans. In the first 6 months after World War I, there were 28 public lynchings, and at least 7 Black Army veterans were murdered while still wearing their uniforms. Historian Carter G. Woodson wrote, "The very uniform on a Black person was to the reactionary like a red rag thrown in the face of a bull. Black soldiers clamoring for equality and justice were beaten, shot down, and lynched to terrorize the whole Black population." White violence against Black veterans was part of a larger reign of terror designed to reinforce racial hierarchies after the war. Over 24 cities and towns witnessed organized anti-Black riots in the Red Summer of 1919, including Houston, Texas, Chicago, Illinois, and Elaine, Arkansas. Earlier this month was the 100th anniversary of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre, where a white mob attacked businesses in Tulsa's Black Wall Street and the surrounding homes in the Greenwood neighborhood. Hundreds of people were killed and thousands left homeless. Carter G. Woodson organized the first Negro History Week in the 1920s, which later expanded into Black History Month, because he was worried about how Black people were being treated in the United States. He saw history as one way to respond to this wave of violence. He wanted Black people to know that they had helped build the country and that there was no American history without African American history. Like Woodson, W.E.B. Du Bois was deeply concerned about how the history of slavery and Reconstruction was being distorted. In 1935, he published a book called Black Reconstruction that included a chapter titled The Propaganda of History. He wrote, "The facts of American history in the last half century have been falsified because the nation was ashamed. The South was ashamed because it fought to perpetuate human slavery. The North was ashamed because it had to call Black troops to save the Union, abolish slavery, and establish democracy." Du Bois worried that Americans were more comfortable with false stories that made them feel good than they were talking honestly about the good and bad parts of the nation's history. And he had reason to worry. Most white historians in his era argued that extending voting rights to formerly enslaved Black people was a political mistake. In this view of Reconstruction, the South was victimized by the North and was justified in passing Jim Crow laws that made Black Americans second-class citizens. This view is called the Dunning School interpretation, and it's named after an influential professor from Columbia University in the early 1900s. This distorted view of Reconstruction was hugely influential. If you took a history course in the 20th century, you likely encountered this version of Reconstruction rather than Du Bois's view, which historians today believe is the more accurate interpretation. This matters because generations of Americans were taught a story about the past that isn't true, and it led generations of white Americans to believe that Black Americans are incapable of taking part in democracy. Both Woodson and Du Bois knew that history was a battleground for democracy, and telling a more truthful history on Juneteenth was part of this battle in the 1920s and 30s. Juneteenth took on a renewed sense of urgency in these years. It was a tradition to read portions of the Emancipation Proclamation at Juneteenth celebrations. One portion of the proclamation reads, "All persons held as slaves shall be forever free, and the government of the United States, including the military, will recognize and maintain the freedom of such persons." Imagine for a moment what it would have been like to hear these words at Juneteenth a century ago, with the Tulsa Massacre still fresh in the news. The audience had to ask, is what we're living through right now actually freedom? I'm currently finishing writing a book on Black Americans in World War II, and I can tell you that questions of voting rights and democracy again figured prominently in Juneteenth celebrations in this era. Black Americans cheered in 1944 when Thurgood Marshall achieved what he called the greatest civil rights victory of his career. Marshall represented Lonnie Smith, a Black dentist from Houston who was denied a ballot in Texas's Democratic primary, in which candidates for Congress, governor, and state office were being nominated. Working alongside his mentor, William Hastie, Marshall argued before the U.S. Supreme Court that the Texas Democratic Party's policy of barring Black people from participating in primary elections violated the 14th and 15th Amendments. Similar voter disenfranchisement tactics across the South enabled whites to dominate a one-party political system for decades. In an 8-1 decision, the Supreme Court's Smith versus Allwright ruling overturned 2 lower court decisions to find all-white primaries were unconstitutional. Smith was celebrated Juneteenth in his hometown of Houston for years after the decision. The Smith decision sent shockwaves across the country because it potentially meant that hundreds of thousands of Black Southerners would gain access to the ballot. The NAACP magazine called it a giant milestone in the progress of Black Americans toward full citizenship, and saw voter registration as the most important step taken toward erasing racial inequities since emancipation. Black World War II veterans returned from Europe and the Pacific and became important leaders in these voting rights and civil rights battles. Like an earlier generation of Black veterans, they risked their lives to fight for democracy at home. Maceo Snipes, for example, was an Army veteran who in 1946 became the first Black person to vote in a Democratic primary in Taylor County, Georgia. A day later, he was shot and killed on the porch of his farmhouse by 4 KKK members. One Black newspaper called Snipes a new martyr in the cause of democracy and freedom in America. He was one of the Black veterans who were honored at Juneteenth celebrations in the years after the war. Medgar Evers loaded cargo for the Black truck drivers on the Red Ball Express, who transported supplies across France after D-Day. After earning 2 Bronze Stars on the beachhead of Normandy and in northern France, Evers celebrated his 21st birthday in 1946 by leading a group of Black veterans who attempted to register to vote in Decatur, Mississippi, only to be turned away by a white mob with guns. He said, "I had been on Omaha Beach. All we Black soldiers wanted was to be ordinary citizens. We fought during the war for America, Mississippi included. Now, after the Germans and Japanese hadn't killed us, it looked as though the white Mississippians would." He continued to fight for civil rights and voting rights until he was assassinated in 1963. Evers was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery on Juneteenth in 1963. That year's Juneteenth celebrations honored Evers and praised the new generation of civil rights activists who breathed new life into the decades-long struggles for freedom. Juneteenth in 1963 became a staging ground for the March on Washington later that summer. In his speech at the March on Washington, Martin Luther King Jr. explicitly referenced the Emancipation Proclamation that Lincoln signed a century earlier. He said, "This momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Black slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. But 100 years later, Black people are still not free. 100 years later, Black people live on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. 100 years later, Black Americans find themselves in exile in their own land." King invoked the idea that America had broken its promise to Black Americans, a common theme in Juneteenth celebrations. King told the crowd, "We've come here today to dramatize a shameful condition. In a sense, we've come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as our citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring the sacred obligation, America has given Black people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds." The rise in popularity of Juneteenth in the late 1960s is also linked to Martin Luther King. King was controversial at the end of his life because he vocally opposed the war in Vietnam and argued that the money could be better spent to fight poverty in America. King's 1967 book, Where Do We Go From Here?, outlined his thinking on economic rights and was a springboard for launching the Poor People's Campaign. In this campaign, King worked to bring together Blacks, Latinos, Asian Americans, Native Americans, and whites in a fight to secure economic justice for the poor. As with his anti-war views, major newspapers argued that King's emphasis on poverty was divisive, and the FBI tried to disrupt the Poor People's Campaign because they believed King was a communist. The Poor People's Campaign was why King was in Memphis in April of 1968. He was there to lead a march to support sanitation workers when he was assassinated. Shortly after King was assassinated, the Poor People's Campaign organized a Solidarity Day rally at the Lincoln Memorial on Juneteenth, 1968. More than 50,000 people attended the rally, which helped the holiday spread more widely across the US. Coretta Scott King, who was an accomplished activist in her own right, addressed the crowd. Speaking just weeks after her husband was killed, and just one day after what would have been their 15th wedding anniversary, Coretta Scott King said, "Perhaps racism in American society can be traced to that dark period in our history when slavery became institutionalized for 244 years, and segregation was practiced for another 100 years. The roots of racism are very deep in the psyche of America. All forms of economic, political, social, and religious exclusion of Black Americans from the mainstream of society can be attributed to racism." For Coretta Scott King and those who gathered on Solidarity Day in 1968, Juneteenth was a time to confront racism head-on. Each of the dates I've mentioned was a pivotal period for the United States. When Black Americans gathered for Juneteenth in each of these years, there were reasons to mourn, but there were also reasons for hope. This hope wasn't based on wishful thinking or blind optimism. It was hope that was rooted in a truthful accounting of history. This is what I meant earlier when I said that Juneteenth is a time for honesty and joy. Being honest about American history makes it clear why it's so important to commemorate emancipation and the long road to freedom. And if we're honest about history, we can see that joy, in the context of Juneteenth, can be a form of resistance and survival. It's about being able to enjoy coming together in community to share food, music, and stories. Coming together every Juneteenth has been annual proof that Black Americans are undaunted despite everything that has happened before and after 1865. William Faulkner once said, "The past isn't dead and buried. In fact, it isn't even past." I hope throughout the presentation so far, you've heard echoes between the past and present. In the final part of the talk, I'd like to make these connections explicit and offer 3 lessons for how the history of Juneteenth can help guide us today as we think about inclusion, diversity, and equity in our workplaces and communities. The first lesson is that actions are more important than words. Central to the story of Juneteenth is the truth that neither the Emancipation Proclamation nor constitutional amendments guaranteed freedom for Black Americans. Movements toward equality only came when these words were backed up by actions. The same thing is true today. Since the summer of 2020, thousands of companies, universities, professional sports teams, and political leaders have issued statements voicing their concern for the lives of Black Americans. These statements are a good first step, but these words ring hollow if they're not followed by actions. I can show you examples of organizations expressing concern about racial prejudice over the past century. But what too often happens is that Americans talk about race without doing anything about racism. If we want this moment to be different, we need to make concrete plans for institutional change and then follow through on them. Second, moving toward equity or entrenching inequity are about choice. The civil rights movement did not happen accidentally, nor was it determined by fate. Hundreds of thousands of people consciously chose to organize locally, nationally, and globally to advance freedom and democracy for all people. These movements took years and decades and were often deeply unpopular at the time. People risked, and in some cases gave, their lives to make America more equitable. On the other hand, inaction is also a choice. Martin Luther King constantly warned people about the myth of time, the idea that racism would eventually fade away or die out. When he addressed racism, he wasn't talking only about the explicit racism of the KKK. He regularly called out white liberals and moderates who were opposed to racism in the South, but had little to say about racism in their own segregated neighborhoods, schools, and workplaces. We're living today amidst structures that have been created through decades of deliberate choices. If we want to see different outcomes, we have to proactively make different choices. Third and finally, when we're thinking about diversity and inclusivity in the workplace and in communities, we can't accept failure as an option. Melody Hobson, co-CEO of Ariel Investments, said, "Saying you're working on diversity is not acceptable. You don't work on anything in corporate America. You either do or you do not." I like the directness of Hobson's statement and the fact that it sounds a little bit like Yoda. We all know that at work, there are different levels of priorities. There are what we might call small p priorities, where it would be nice if goals are achieved, but it's tacitly understood that they're of secondary importance. Too often, diversity and inclusivity falls into this category. On the other hand, there are capital P priorities, where failure isn't accepted as an option. That is what this moment calls for. We need to treat diversity and inclusivity as a priority that's mission critical to every corporation and organization, and that has the resources, leadership, visibility, and buy-in to succeed. I'd like to close by talking about what Juneteenth means today. Last year, there was a Juneteenth celebration and rally in a part of Central Park that was once called Seneca Village, where freed Black people and Irish immigrants lived before the Civil War. One of the signs at that Juneteenth event read, "Black history is now." I think that sentiment is true. We're living through a pivotal historical moment that will likely be discussed in history classes for generations to come. Last year, Juneteenth came less than a month after the murder of George Floyd, and in the midst of Black Lives Matter protests, in which more than 25 million Americans participated. It was, by most accounts, the largest social movement in US history. Since last summer, I've been asked dozens of times whether our current historical moment is a turning point. As a historian, I can tell you that turning points are determined by what people do or don't do on a day-to-day basis. So the question of whether or not 2020 or 2021 will be a turning point for our workplaces, communities, and nation is really up to all of us. Juneteenth should inspire us to be honest about history, to make space in our lives for joy, and to be bold enough to choose the futures to which we aspire. Thank you, and I welcome your questions.
Wow, that was, oh my God. The comments, I just want you to know, that are coming through, like powerful presentation. I wasn't taught this in school, wasn't taught this until after grad school. I mean, or learned this information until after grad school. Just powerful. Thank you so much, Dr. Delmont. So now I'm going to share some questions that have shown up, and please, people, please keep writing. This is a great opportunity. We have an expert here and we can find out so many answers to our questions. Here's the first question. I noticed that when quoting the Emancipation Proclamation, Dr. Delmont specifically included that Lincoln was freeing the enslaved individuals in a state that has succeeded. Number one, was this decision made in order to not penalize the states who chose not to succeed? And two, since the Confederate States succeeded from the US, wouldn't that mean that Lincoln did not have any legal authority to free the enslaved folks?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really great question. And there's a lot of sort of detail and nuance to the Emancipation Proclamation. And both those points are spot on. So on the first point, the Emancipation Proclamation explicitly does not reference those border states that had slavery but were friendly to the Union. That's entirely a political decision. So that Lincoln does not call out those states because he wants to keep them on the side of the Union to help fight and win the Civil War. And then to the second point, that's exactly right. So the Emancipation Proclamation is Lincoln speaking about territory that he does not yet control, right? So that's part of the sort of that we need to understand. The Emancipation Proclamation is a really powerful document. So I don't want to say that it's not important that Lincoln didn't come out at that time to make that statement, but it didn't actually it hardly freed anyone, right? At the point in time that it was released. It wasn't until the Union gained military control of those different Confederate states that they were able to liberate enslaved people in those states. So I really appreciate that first question, because again, I think it's important now that Juneteenth is receiving more attention that yes, it does mark the end of slavery in a way, but it hopefully causes us to think about the end of slavery was messy, complicated, and it didn't result in immediate freedom for Black Americans. And that's the story we need to be telling about Juneteenth. It's not a story where we say, okay, Emancipation Proclamation reached Texas and then therefore problem solved, everything was great after that. Juneteenth should encourage us to reread the Emancipation Proclamation and wonder why are there all these caveats there? Why are there all these sort of details about who is and is not included? So really appreciate that as a first question.
Absolutely. We have another question here, and it is, with the truth being so far from what is currently being taught, how do we move toward true American history, inclusive of all American history, without creating pushback from parents?
It's another really good question. Before we started the webinar, Fanny, Elijah, and I were talking about the various movements in different parts of the country to restrict what's even possible to teach. So a lot of what I just shared in today's presentation is exactly what states like Texas, other states, or New Hampshire at one point are trying to prevent being taught in K through 12 education. I'm not sure if there's a way to prevent pushback. I think history has always been a battleground. This has been true as long as the sort of profession has existed. So I think it's a matter of recognizing it's a battleground and fighting for more accurate, truthful tellings of history and making a really strong case for why that's important. That it's not just important to Black Americans, not just important to other people of color, but it's important to all Americans, that we need to get this story right. It doesn't do our nation any good if we're trying to be a multiracial democracy to tell a whites only version of our country's history, right? That's not a version of our history that allows us to create a future in which all of us can be equal participants. That's a message that we have to keep going back to. And then I think another thing, and again, I don't think everyone is open to hearing the truth, but as much as possible, trying to go back to primary sources and what people said at the time. People like to talk all sorts of nonsense online and elsewhere in different political forums about the history of the Civil War and Reconstruction, or even sort of the founding of Texas. The Texas governor, I think, just announced that an 1836 commission to push back against the 1619 project, which for historians, like, yeah, let's talk about the history of Texas, right? Like the history of Texas was explicitly a slave-holding state, right? They seceded from the Union. The Confederate States made no bones about the fact that they were leaving the Union because they wanted to hold human beings as property, right? We have to be able to talk honestly about that. And I think the last thing I'll say on this is, and this might sound naive, this doesn't have to be an entirely partisan issue, right? I don't think an honest accounting of history means that you're going to vote for one party or the other. I think honest accounting of history, for myself, it's a professional obligation. I have to tell the truth about what happened. I have to tell the truth in public. Once you have that truth, you can still make different political decisions about what party you want to vote for, which candidate you want to vote for. But if we can't talk honestly about the facts, then we're never going to have an honest, meaningful dialogue, even at the local, sort of small community level within school boards, or much less at the national level.
Absolutely. You know, with all of the sharing of this history, how do you see this showing up in 2021, be it within communities, in the workplace, that's leaving out this valuable part of history?
Yeah, so I think we're at a really pivotal moment here. I don't think we would be having these broader conversations about Juneteenth and slavery and Black history at large if it wasn't for the murder of George Floyd last summer and the massive Black Lives Matter protests and the activists who organized all those protests. I think they forced these issues onto the table. And so I think now the challenge to us as citizens is to take these conversations very seriously. I don't think most workplaces commonly talk about the history of slavery. I don't think most community groups commonly talk about the history of slavery. This pushes us well past the sort of happy talk of diversity that we sometimes fall into, right? Where we just think if we sort of make space for everyone at the table and sort of have some community programs, everything will be fine. The reason we have such deeply rooted inequalities in our society today is because of history. And I think we need to be able to find ways to talk more honestly about that. And I'm hopeful. I think it's hard to have those conversations with people you don't trust. And so I think these conversations have to start at the neighborhood level, at the workplace level, at the school level, hopefully trying to build bonds of trust so these conversations aren't easy to have. Like they make people feel emotional, both good and bad. They make people feel guilty sometimes, particularly for white Americans. But I don't see another way forward other than to take our obligation as citizens to engage with this history very seriously. And that's what I mean about not watering down the history of Juneteenth. And my worry is Juneteenth has always been celebrated within Black communities. It's always going to be celebrated within Black communities. If, as it crosses over into the mainstream, if it gets watered down so people just think it's a day off work or a day to grill out, right? I mean, I love a cookout as much as anybody else, but it's a cookout with a purpose, right? It's a cookout to sort of reckon with this history. We have to do both together. And so as more people are talking about Juneteenth, I want to make sure that they talk about the history and what Juneteenth is about.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We have some more questions.
Yeah.
Do you see any connections between the pardoning of Confederate soldiers and the refusal to set up the commission on January 6th?
That's a good question. I think I would have to think more about that. I mean, I think there are obviously links. I think that what we saw on January 6th emerges from that version of history that would suggest that the Confederacy was not so bad, or in fact that it had the right ideas in mind. That has deep roots in our country, and not just among people who consider themselves explicitly racist. As I mentioned, if you attended a history class at a fancy university like Dartmouth, where I'm teaching right now, or almost any major university, or even most high schools in the 20th century, and you read about the history of Reconstruction, it was termed radical Reconstruction, right? And that's a very politically charged framing work, right? Because it suggests that the North overreached, like that's what was radical. That radical idea was trying to provide Black people with actual rights and actual freedoms. It's very hard to undo those mistruths and those historical lies that have been told. And so I do think there are connections between pardoning Confederate troops and the kind of sympathy for the Confederacy and that kind of lost cause, and the sense that it's somehow authorized to take over the nation's capital and bring Confederate flags and Nazi swastikas and other symbols of white nationalism into the nation's capital. The connection there is a distorted view of history that would suggest that it's a white person's country.
Thank you. We have more questions. Here's a question. One participant writes, I supported in a rally near my home last year. But to be honest, I never knew what more I could do to make a big change. What can we do in a community, at the community level, to make big changes and to support equity for everyone, or equality for everyone?
Yeah, great question. And so it's going to vary community by community, but I think becoming involved and knowledgeable about the nitty gritty of community and local politics, that's where the rubber hits the road on a lot of these issues in terms of school equality and school segregation, housing affordability and zoning, issues about police accountability, police reform, police abolition, if people want to go as far as that. Those are, in some cases, those are often national level discussions, but a lot of that doesn't happen in DC. A lot of that happens at local city council meetings that are often not well attended, right? You get a handful of people who are really passionate, and then most people, because lives are busy, right? You don't have time to go to every meeting. I think if you want to see change at the local level, becoming more involved in local community and bring a friend, right? That none of this is possible to do by yourself, that you have to organize with people at the neighborhood level, within your churches, with whatever community groups you're a part of. But I think, to give one specific example, from within Minneapolis, where I'm from, one of the real issues about school segregation, housing segregation, was that they had zoning laws about single family housing. So that within the city of Minneapolis, they zoned certain areas so they couldn't have apartments or multifamily dwellings. That by definition meant that you'd have fewer working class and low income families, fewer communities of color, being able to live within city boundaries, right? They were able to change that to allow zoning for more multifamily housing and more kind of duplexes and small apartment complexes. That's a very specific policy issue that can have ramifications in terms of who can and cannot live within communities. And then that, based on how schools are zoned, has ramifications for how the school population looks. So a lot of that gets into kind of very kind of nerdy policy stuff, but I think that's where a lot of these decisions need to get made.
Absolutely, absolutely. We have from another participant. In academic settings, I was taught that some Black Americans faced worse conditions on plantations when they were enslaved on them. This was because, unlike in chattel slavery, the plantation owners had little incentive to not harm or even kill a Black person since they were no longer their property. What are your thoughts on this, or accuracy?
The question is about the period after the end of slavery. I'm sorry, could you say that one again?
Okay, not a problem. I was taught that some Black Americans face worse conditions on plantations. Was this because of the plantation owners had little incentive to not harm or even kill a Black person since they were no longer their property?
Thank you. So I think that the question is about treatment on plantations as sharecroppers or wage workers after the Civil War. So there is some evidence of that you didn't see. So the phenomenon of lynching wasn't as pronounced before slavery ended, for exactly the reason that the questioner states, that when Black Americans were being held as property, that meant that there was a disincentive and there were legal repercussions if someone took their life, right? And so the slave owner would met out all sorts of physical punishment, but was unlikely to to physically kill a Black person. They might work them to a condition like death, but was unlikely to kill them. After the Civil War, once Black people are sort of theoretically out of slavery, you do see a lot of more of that kind of extra legal violence against Black communities, groups like the KKK, because they're trying to threaten and keep Black people in quote unquote their place from the white perspective. On plantations themselves, there was still just a sense that they would work their Black sharecroppers and wage workers as much as they could. There was very little recourse that Black workers could have. Right, there wasn't until much later there weren't unions you could go to seek justice in any way. Right, if the person who's abusing you is the person on whose land you live, right, you don't have much to fight back with.
Yes, thank you. And still they're coming in. So what message do you have for our sisters and brothers who think in or say, why do we have to learn about slavery? Can't we just move forward? What is your response to that?
I would say we can't move forward without reckoning honestly with that history. Right? I think, let me maybe answer in a couple more ways, with more nuance. I think there are good reasons to balance how much time we spend talking about slavery and spend time talking about the tremendous amount of violence that Black people have experienced and continue to experience. I'm worried today, so I don't watch any of the videos that are made of people being killed by police and others. For my own psyche, I can't. And I think from that perspective, I think we have to be mindful of our own mental health when we're talking about history. That history for Black Americans there's a lot, right? I think about this in the classroom all the time, that like you have to balance how much you talk about much you talk about slavery and lynching and the Rodney King beating and police brutality today. Like, I want to speak honestly, but also students can only take so much, right? I think that's true for anyone. So I think based on the question, I would say that like we have to be mindful of how much we can take.
Absolutely.
But we can't ignore it entirely. And so I think there's different ways of approaching it. Like, you can talk about slavery without having to look at the images of slaves' scarred backs, right? You can talk about it from a policy perspective, right? Trying to understand the legal aspects of it in ways that try to provide some distance so we can understand like, what was this? How did it shape the economic situation of our country and the political situation of our country? But I think we have to, whatever way works to get your bearings, you can't understand what's going on in 2021 if you don't understand the history, right? You just fundamentally can't. None of it makes sense, right? You can't understand the vast racial wealth gaps between Black communities and white communities without that history. And so as painful as it is, particularly for Black Americans, we have to find ways to understand it and then balance it with the sort of deep wellsprings of joy in our history as well. I think that's the thing I always worry about, particularly in Black History Month, is that we sometimes focus on a lot of the kind of marches and martyrs approach. There's so many tremendous stories of business owners and sort of athletes and singers and just everyday people, right? Who've joy is as much a part of our history as sort of the trauma and the pain has been. And I want to make sure that comes through as well.
Absolutely. I know when I think about what you're saying, I kept thinking about the movie 12 Years a Slave. When I watched that, I could only watch it once. And I know that there are people who watched it more than once. And the trauma of it all, I just could only watch it once. Here's another question. How do we include children in these conversations?
Great question. So start at an age appropriate level. So there are great books today about important historical figures who provide entry points into this, about Harriet Tubman, about Rosa Parks, about Martin Luther King, Coretta Scott King. They start for as young as kids like 4, 5, 6 years old. And then there's the middle school age appropriate ones. Kids get it. Kids understand the basic concepts of free and unfree, right? They understand segregation, what it would mean to not be able to go to a white drinking fountain or a Black drinking fountain, right? So I think that's one approach. Another approach is to talk about the role that children have played in these different moments in history, right? You can talk about what it was like to be an enslaved child, what it was like to be a child working on these plantations just after slavery and as a sharecropping family, what it was like to attend a segregated school during Jim Crow, what it was like to be forced to sit in the back of the bus or walk to school while the white bus drove past and splashed mud on you, right? The one I like to use is from Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail. He talks about trying to explain to a 6-year-old daughter why she couldn't go to the amusement park called Funtown that was advertised on television, and how tears welled up in her eyes. Like, that's such a powerful example. Like that's what white supremacy meant to a 6-year-old, right? Whatever was going on politically, she might have understood, but like, I want to go ride the roller coaster, right? I want to go to the amusement park, and I can't, right?
Mhm.
And then it allows you to sort of talk about like, what kind of society puts those policies in place? Like, the only reason you'd have policies about Black kids can't go to swimming pools is because you're trying to demean people, right? That's, and kids get it, right? And so I think there's all sorts of great resources people can use, but I think it's important, regardless of one's racial background, you can't wait until they show up in my college classroom, right? I get some students, particularly white students, have never thought about this at all, right? Now they're 18 and they're looking at me like they feel like I did something wrong. Well, you're trying to tell me all this stuff. And so regardless of whatever your racial background is, like, find ways to explain this history to your kids at age appropriate levels so that they understand and they can process it. Because I guarantee you they're ready for it. No matter how young they are, they're ready to understand it.
Absolutely, absolutely. So do you have a list of resources that you would be able to share with us and we could share with our participants after the session today?
Sure, yeah, I can send you a couple things. The ones I can mention right now, the great scholar Ibram X. Kendi, who's at Boston University, his book Stamped, it's about history of racism. He's got one now, sort of a children's edition. I think there's like a baby edition, a middle school edition. So he's got a whole enterprise of books about anti-racism that I think are quite solid. The ones I like with my kids, there's a series of books called it's I Am Rosa Parks, I Am Martin Luther King. There's also I Am Albert Einstein, I Am Helen Keller. Those have worked really well because they're pretty up to date on the scholarship, but it's pitched in a way that my kids now are 7 and 9. We started when they were 4 and 6. It got them understanding the history of Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, and Harriet Tubman very early on in ways that, for myself as a historian, I was like, yeah, that's pretty accurate. Like that's a scaled down version of what I would do in the classroom. So I was happy with it.
Pretty powerful, pretty powerful coming from you. And so I think we have time for one last question, and that is, what is the release date of your upcoming book?
I appreciate you asking. So finishing edits right now from my editor. It should be out in fall of next year. So fall of 2022 from Viking Books. And it's called Half American, the epic story of African Americans, or epic story of Black Americans fighting World War II at home and abroad. Okay,
awesome. This has been just an amazing experience. And it's showing up in our chat boxes, and people are appreciative and saying, thank you so much for this. And we can't wait to hear more from you. And I'm hoping that we can get you back, that you will come back and talk with us and share more of your wonderful historical perspectives on things that took place that was missing from our history books. And I can't thank you enough. So thank you so much, Dr. Delmont, for
thank you.
All of your work that you're doing and what you shared with us today. So much appreciated.
It was a real pleasure. And thank you for everyone for tuning in and for all the great questions.
Awesome. Thank you. And for all of you out there who are getting ready to continue on with your day, we want to thank you all. And we invite you to come back in July when we have our next speaker. And what we want to say that, again, thank you. You could have spent this hour anyplace else, but you decided to spend it with us. And for that, we are eternally grateful. Thank you. Everybody have a fabulous day. You deserve it.